Tick, Tick, Boom is a 2021 American biographical musical comedy drama film directed by Lin-Manuel Miranda in his feature directorial debut. Written by Stephen Levinson, who also serves as an executive producer, it is based on the stage musical of the same name by Jonathan Larson, a semi-autobiographical story about Larson writing a musical to enter into the theater industry. The film stars Andrew Garfield as Larson, alongside Robin DeJesus, Alexandra Shipp, Joshua Henry, Judith Light, and Vanessa Hudgens. Tick, Tick, Boom had its world premiere at the AFI Fest on November 10, 2021, and began a limited theatrical release 2 days later, before streaming on Netflix on November 19. The film received positive reviews for Garfield's performance and Miranda's direction. It was named one of the best films of 2021 by the American Film Institute, and was nominated for Best Motion Picture, Musical or Comedy at the 79th Golden Globe Awards, and Best Picture at the 27th Critics' Choice Awards. For his performance, Garfield earned numerous awards, including the Golden Globe Award for Best Actor Motion Picture Musical or Comedy, as well as a nomination for the Academy Award for Best Actor. History. The show was first performed as a workshop between September 6 and September 9, 1990 by Jonathan Larson at the off-Broadway Playhouse Second Stage Theater under the title Boho Days. Larson revised the developing piece following the second stage workshop, changing the title to Tick, Tick, Boom, and presented with him as performer in November 1991 at the Village Gate, and then later in 1992 and 1993 in the O Solo Mio Fests at New York Theatre Workshop. Larson performed the show as a rock monologue, a new form of theatre for the time. The performance attracted the attention of a young producer named Jeffrey Seller, who became a fan of Larson's work. In 1995, he saw the New York Theatre Workshop production of Larson's musical Rent and convinced his fellow producers to bring it to Broadway. After Larson's death in 1996, Leacock asked David Auburn, author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning play Proof, to reconfigure Tick, Tick, Boom. He restructured the monologue into a 3-actor musical, with one actor playing John and the other 2 actors playing Michael and Susan, as well as all the other roles in the show. Also, the script and score were streamlined and edited. This revised version of the piece premiered off-Broadway at the Jane Street Theatre on May 23, 2001. Auburn received credit as script consultant. Plot. John is an aspiring composer for musical theatre, who lives in Soho, New York. The year is 1990, and as his 30th birthday approaches, John is worried about his aging and lack of achievement. Michael, a friend of John's since childhood, gave up acting to pursue a more lucrative career in marketing. Susan, John's girlfriend, is a dancer who teaches ballet to wealthy and untalented children. On the roof of his apartment building, John reveals that he is nervous about an upcoming workshop of his newest musical, Superbia. When Susan comes to join him, he comments on her dress and how beautiful it makes her look. The next morning, Susan asks John about the possibility of leaving New York. John is torn between following his dream of composing and opting for security and family in a different career. His reverie is cut short when he remembers his day job as a waiter in a Soho diner. After work, Michael picks John up in his brand new BMW to show John his new apartment. Michael exults at the thought of a life of luxury, and pressures John further to consider changing his career path. He agrees to accompany Michael to work the next day and visit a brainstorming session at his firm. Back at home, John plans to spend the remainder of the evening composing, but is interrupted by a call from Susan. At Michael's office, the brainstorming session involves naming a cooking fat substitute through a convoluted process. John sees the futility of the process and his unwillingness to cooperate gets him removed from the meeting. As John drives Michael to the airport for a business trip, they argue about the meeting. Michael tells John that the life Susan wants doesn't sound bad, and that he wishes his job could give him the chance to settle down. After dropping Michael off, John goes to a rehearsal for Superbia, but not before stopping to get a snack of Twinkies. At the market, he spies Caressa Johnson, one of his actors for Superbia. She reveals a similar weakness for Twinkies, and this leads to a sudden friendship between the two. After the rehearsal, Susan sees John and Caressa walking together and becomes jealous. John begs Susan to stay and be with him. Despite this, she leaves for home, and John thinks about what may have happened to make her behave this way. The next morning, John arrives early at the theater for the workshop of Superbia. Caressa steals the show with her performance of Come to Your Senses. John gets many congratulations, but no offers to produce the show, and so, in his eyes, the workshop has been a failure. John visits Michael and tells him that he is through with music. Michael says that while he enjoys how he makes a lot more money now, he finds the job to be banal and unrewarding. The two argue, and John yells at Michael for not understanding fear or insecurity. Michael responds by telling John that he is HIV positive. Shocked, John leaves quickly and wanders through Central Park until he finds himself at the closed Delacorte Theatre. He finds an old rehearsal piano and begins to play it while collecting his thoughts. John ponders on whether the amount of sacrifice required for his career in music is worth it, and whether those telling him to have it all, play the game, are right. Ultimately, he realizes that he will only be happy as a professional composer, no matter what hardships that may bring. The next morning is John's 30th birthday party. He sees Susan, who is getting ready to leave. She gives him his birthday gift, 1,000 sheets of blank manuscript paper. They agree to write to each other, and she leaves. The phone rings, and the caller is John's idol, Stephen Sondheim. Sondheim leaves John his contact information so they can meet and discuss Superbia. John realizes that he is surrounded by friends and that his talents are finally being recognized. Characters: Jonathan, Michael, Susan. Musical numbers: 30/90ths John, Michael, Susan. Green dress John, Susan. Johnny can't decide John, Susan, Michael. Sunday John and diner patrons. No more Michael, John. Therapy John, Susan. Times Square. Real life Michael and Company. Sugar John, Caressa, Counter Guy. See Her Smile John and Company. Superbia intro. Come to Your Senses Caressa. Why John? 30/90ths reprise John. Louder Than Words Company notes. No More features a sample from Movin' On Up, the theme song of the television series The Jeffersons. Sunday, John's song at the diner, is based on the Act I finale from the Stephen Sondheim musical Sunday in the Park with George. Larson conceived it as a humorous homage to Sondheim, one of his largest influences. In Johnny Can't Decide, all the characters are referring to themselves in third person, just like George in the song Lesson No. 8 from Sunday in the Park with George. In the monologue version of the musical, only John did this. Another reference to Sondheim is present in the song Why. Not only mentioning West Side Story in the lyrics, the song utilizes the same tritone made famous in the West Side Story song Maria. Why contains fragments of several other songs, Yellow Bird, Let's Go Fly a Kite from the film Mary Poppins, Cool and Tonight Quintet both from West Side Story, and Come to Your Senses from Larson's Superbia. On the cast recording, there is an additional song cut from the final version of the show, Boho Days. This track is one of the few recordings of Larsson's voice publicly available. It was extracted from a demo tape recorded by Larsson during the development of Tick, Tick, Boom. On the 1989 demo album of Tick, Tick, Boom, one track is Why, performed by Larsson himself. In this recording, in place of Come to Your Senses is a fragment of LCD Readout, which also comes from Superbia Productions. Casts. 2001 Off-Broadway premiere. The revamped musical premiered off-Broadway at the Jane Street Theatre on May 23, 2001, and closed on January 6, 2002. Directed by Scott Schwartz, with choreography by Christopher Gattelli, the cast was Raul Esparza as John, Jerry Dixon as Michael, and Amy Spanger as Susan. Molly Ringwald and Natasha Diaz later replaced Spanger as Susan, and Joey McIntyre replaced Esparza as John. The production received 7 Drama Desk Award nominations, including Outstanding Musical, and won the Outer Critics Circle Award for Outstanding Off-Broadway Musical. Esparza won an Obie Award for his performance. The original cast recording was released in 2001 by RCA Victor Broadway. The off-Broadway production was imported to Seoul, South Korea briefly, with McIntyre, Dixon, and Diaz making up the cast. 2003 American National Tour. A touring production of the show was directed by Schwartz, with Christian Campbell as John, Nikki Snelson as Susan, and Wilson Cruz as Michael. The tour performed in Dallas, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, East Lansing, Michigan, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Minneapolis, Hershey, Pennsylvania, Nashville, Washington, D.C., Pittsburgh, Chicago, and Boston. 2005 London premiere. Tick, Tick, Boom opened in London at the Menier Chocolate Factory on May 31, 2005, running until August 28, 2005. Again directed by Scott Schwartz, the cast featured Neil Patrick Harris as John, later replaced by Christian Campbell TJ as Michael, and Cassidy Jansen as Susan. 2005 06 California Productiona. California production ran at the Rubicon Theater Company in Ventura, California, from November 19, 2005, through December 18, 2005. Scott Schwartz directed, with a cast including Andrew Samansky as John, Wilson Cruz as Michael, and Natasha Diaz as Susan. The production moved to the Coronet Theater, West Hollywood, California, through July 16, 2006, with Tammy Tappan Damiano as Susan. 2005 Canadian premiere. A Toronto production was mounted by Acting Upstage Theatre Company at the Port Alex Theatre in 2005. The director was Mario D'Alamonte, and the cast consisted of Dean Armstrong as John, Michael Dufayes as Michael, and Daphne Mons as Susan. 2009 London West End premiere. Tick, Tick, Boom had its West End premiere in a limited engagement at the Duchess Theatre from May 13–17, 2009, forming part of the 2009 Notes from New York season. Directed by Hannah Kysick, the cast comprised Paul Keating as John, Julie Atherton as Susan, and Leon Lopez as Michael. 2014 Encores. Off-Center Revival. New York City Center's Encores. Off-Center series produced a revival of Tick, Tick, Boom, starring Lin-Manuel Miranda as John, Karen Olivo as Susan, and Leslie Odom Jr. as Michael. Performances were June 25 through 28, 2014. Oliver Butler directed. 2016 Off-Broadway revival Tick, Tick, Boom was revived in October 2016 at the Acorn Theatre at Theatre Row, starring Sierra Renee, Nick Blameyer, and George Salazar. Previews began on October 4, the show opened on October 20, and it closed on December 18, 2016. It was directed by Jonathan Silverstein, the artistic director of Keane Company. Lily Cooper took over the role of Susan on November 22, 2016. Other productions. 2003–2004 European premiere. The Hungarian production opened on July 23, 2003, on the open-air stage of Pécs, Hungary. It was directed by Thomas Bajlako, the director of the National Theatre of Pécs, with musical direction by Zoltán Bakai. The cast was Attila Nemeth as John, Lila Polyak as Susan, and Istvan Filler/Thomas Gregorovics as Michael. The production moved to the National Theatre of Pécs, where it opened on November 4, 2003, with new cast members, Bernadette Tunyagy as Susan and Attila Ksendry as John. The production closed on February 26, 2004. 2007 Danish premiere. A Danish production played in 2007, starring Mads Bull Nielsen as John, Thomas Bay Peterson as Michael, and Christina Elizabeth McRae as Susan, and directed by Jens Frausing. A recording of the Danish production was released in 2007. 2008 Mexican premiere starring Marco Antonio as John, Natalia Sosa as Susan and Beto Torres as Michael. This production opened at Teatro Rafael Solana on February 20, 2008. 2008 Canadian premiere. Ignition Theatre produced the production in May 2008 at the Matchbox in Red Deer, Alberta, Canada. It starred Joel Crichton as John, Will-Marie Myberg as Susan, and Curtis LaBelle as Michael. The production ran from May 15 to 24. 2009 Westport production. The production at the Westport Country Playhouse in Westport, Connecticut ran from June 23 through July 18. It was directed by Scott Schwartz, who directed the original off-Broadway production, and starred Colin Hanlon as John, Wilson Cruz as Michael, and Pearl Sun as Susan. 2009 Manila premiere. A Philippine production ran for 3 weeks in August 2009 at the Ateneo de Manila University. It was staged by Blue Repertory, the university's college-level musical theater group, under the direction of Bea Garcia. 2010 San Francisco Premiere Theater. Rhinoceros presented the play at the Eureka Theater from February 9 through 28, 2010. 2010 German premiere. The German premiere of the musical opened on March 11, 2010, in Kerpen near Cologne. It was directed by Barbara Frank and Marco Masiewski with musical supervision by Philip Paulson. John was played by Oliver Morschell and Daniel Wichman, Michael by Sasha Odendahl and Joshua Vithayathil, and Susan by Marina Schmitz and Michaela Berg. The songs were performed in English, with scenes done in German. 2010 London Fringe production. The Union Theatre performed Tick, Tick, Boom in April 2010, featuring Leanne Jones, Ashley Campbell, and Adam Rhys Davies. It was directed by Damian Sandys. 2011 Spanish premieres. A Spanish production ran at Teatro Lara, Madrid, from July 14 through 22, 2011, under the direction of Pablo Muñoz Chapuli and starring Jorge Gonzalo as John, David Tortosa as Michael, and Laura Castrillan as Susan. 2011 London revival. Tick, Tick, Boom opened in London at the Africa Centre on October 14, 2011, directed by Simon Carnell. The cast featured Samuel Houghton as John, David Adams as Michael, and Katrina Boyd as Susan. 2012 Argentinian premiere. The 2012 Argentinian production of Tick, Tick, Boom ran at the Mapo Cabaret Theatre under the direction of Nicolas Roberto and starred Andres Espinel as Mike, Natalia Cesari as Susan, and Paul Genet as John. 2014 Dutch premiere. Tresor Productions performed at various theatres in the Netherlands from March 3–May 3, 2014, under the direction of Koen van Dijk, starring John Voiges as John, Renee van Wegberg as Susan, and Sander van Voorst tot Voorst as Mike. 2018 Czech premiere. The Czech premiere of the musical was performed at Theater Na Pradel, Prague under the direction of Martin Vokoun and starred Peter Pecha as Mike, Lucia Jajirkov as Susan, and Tom Vank as John. 2018 Hong Kong premiere. A Cantonese production was performed in Ngao Chi Wan Civic Centre Theatre by Theatre Company Musical Trio in 2018. 2018 to 2019 Brazilian premiere. A Portuguese production ran at Teatro FAAP in Sao Paulo from October 30, 2018 to January 31, 2019. It was directed by Leopoldo Pacheco and Bel Gomez and starred Bruno Narqui as John, Thiago Machado as Michael, and Julia Nadruz as Susan. 2019 Taiwan premiere. A production ran at the New Taipei City Arts Center in October 2019, featuring New York actor Matthew Bauman as John, Anthony Neely as Mike, and Ting Fang Lu as Susan. Produced by the Tainan Ensemble, the production was directed by New York director Darren Cohen. 2022 Swedish premiere. Produced by Fourth Wall Productions in Malmö and directed by Swedish director Helena Rohr. John played by Philip Wikström, Michael played by Eric Espinoza and Susan played by Kim Bergqvist. Awards and nominations.